So I have the pleasure again to introduce somebody I really admire and look up to. Richard Speer is a paradox. He always makes me feel underdressed and also that I just missed the party. He's the only visual arts critic that I send press releases to that still insists that I send him a fax, where everyone else is fine with an email. Richard Speer is the visual arts critic for the Willamette Week, a Pulitzer Prize-winning weekly newspaper here in Portland that hopefully all of you have picked up. He's also a critic for Art Limited and Visual Art Source. He recently was the author of Matt Lamb, The Art of Success, a biography of the outsider artist Matt Lamb that I strongly encourage all of you to pick up. And he was recently the contributing writer to the most recent Peter Halley exhibition catalog for his exhibition in New York. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Richard Speer. Thank you.
You're invited to the party. Always. Standing invite. I like it by snail mail, too, not just fax. To back up the email. Hello. Thank you so much for having me here. It has been nice to visit with those of you that I have known for years now, and some of you whom I've written about, and to be meeting others of you for the first time. It is a great privilege to be here because I feel I'm talking to you today not as an art critic, but as a fan. I have always kind of looked at artists as rock stars and just thought that I was lucky to be at the concert, much less backstage. So to be able to come here and talk about one of my favorite subjects is a great privilege. I'm going to hopscotch around a little bit in my remarks from sort of art historical analyses and different ways of looking at color to personal experiences that I have in my daily life with color and ways that I have of dealing with it that perhaps you might pick and choose ways that you could glean and integrate into your life or your practice. And finally, at the end, I want to talk about some of the artworks that are at the exhibition where we're going to be going to the reception, Chroma-CULTURE, which commemorates this exhibition. So if I seem to hopscotch around the color wheel a little bit, there is allegedly a method to my madness. First of all, I have come over the last several years to think of color as a kind of God. It was here before we were here. It shall remain after we are committed to the earth or scattered to the four winds. It banged the first big bang that happened. I mean, the minute that the explosion took place, radiation and light came out. And if something ordained, let there be light, well, then the instant there was light, there was also color. Whether or not there were eyes or other receptors to sense that it was there or not, it was. Like a God, color is infinite. There are infinitudes between a brick red and a fire engine red and a tomato red that we cannot divine. We cannot quantify these. They are beyond calibration. They are Excalibur. And we can only get as accurate as we can. Colors have witnessed everything. Think of Prussian blue. Think of what cobalt has seen and what saffron has seen and white. And color is every bit as venerable as any icon or golden Buddha around the world. To make an art object out of glass in particular is to channel the energy of the universe through a prism. The task of making an object out of glass that is more beautiful inherently than just a chunk of glass or a pane of glass is a tall order. It's like being asked to write a haiku that describes the sound of rushing water and hoping that your words will be as beautiful as the sound of rushing water. My hat is off to those of you who do it. It is a tough order, but those who do it are the cathedral builders. So we have something that is timeless, that is omnipresent, that is infinite, and that is venerable. These are the properties of deity. I put this image of Ellsworth Kelly's Spectrum 4 from 1967. And by the way, doesn't it look like 1967? Wow. Because my contention is that one criterion for the success of any given artwork is it as good as if you had taken all of the component colors out of that artwork and lined them up in a row? Or if it was already a stripe painting or something of rectilinear geometry like Barnett Newman or Richard Riley or Tim Bavington, or some of the works we saw earlier from Beverly Fishman, then the question becomes, if you would take out the component colors of that and put them on a palette and hand it to Raphael, would it be more effective? So these are tall orders. One of my favorite artists of all time, the second generation abstract expressionist Sam Francis, wrote in one of his aphorisms that color is light on fire. I maintain that color is also thought on fire, because it is impossible to separate colors from the associations that we are bound to put upon them. Why is Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter not Viridian? Why, wherefore Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death, why not fuchsia? It is because we are born, before we are born now with the benefit of sonogram, if in fact that is a benefit, our parents will know whether we stick out or fold inward, and upon that dubious basis decide what color our rooms are going to be, our cribs, our bibs, our onesies, etc. Our very attitudes must be either blue or pink, or else some travesty of nature will allegedly occur. We're getting better about that, I think, as a culture, but look at any catalog that caters to parents of newborns, and you see we still have a long way to go. So from out the birth canal, we emerge into this world of woozy blobs that we learn to differentiate, so we are told by child psychologists and neurologists from the age of 2 months by the basis of color. And we are still trying to differentiate those shapes by color and figure it all out. One of my great tutorials on color came in 2003 when I went to sit a while with Robert Gamblin, a treasure. And I wanted to pick his brain, and I wanted to ask him questions that in retrospect were kind of asinine, but hopefully in a metaphysical way. These were questions such as, when does pink become hot pink? What makes electric blue electric, other than electrification? Is chartreuse more yellowish green or greenish yellow? These are things that Arsenio Hall used to say make you go, He was very patient with me, and he quickly took this kind of airy train of thought into a much more practical direction and said, well, come on over here, let's go over to the studio. And he got a bunch of paint tubes and mashed it out, got a palette knife, and we talked about it. And what we came to was a kind of Joseph Albersian conclusion that while any given color's properties may be absolute if we assign a number on the spectrum of light to it, that our perception of color is subjective to our own associations. Let me pause for a second and tell you one of my favorite things in the world to do is to sit alone in a quiet, well-lit room and look at swatches of color. The kind that you find at a paint store, the kind that, interior decorating books, or the Pantone book that's up across the way at the hall where we were just adjourning. And to have no agenda, to have not only a retinal experience, but also a symbolic experience, to surrender to whatever the color is in a kind of meditation, to contemplate a color and ask ourselves not only where it takes us, but when it takes us. Why is that shade of musty, minty green a time warp back to the Rococo? Why do we say certain colors are autumnal, whereas others take us to the tropics so strongly that we can practically hear the Junkanoo band or the bossa nova or the samba in our mind's ear? The subjective experience of color, as I think of it, is influenced by a book by Rudolf Arnheim, the psychologist and theorist. It was a 1954 book that is called The Art and Visual Perception, a Psychology of the Creative Eye. He advanced a concept of visual metonymy. Now, metonymy comes from the word metonym. It's the same family of linguistic terms as antonym, homonym, synonym, metonym. And a metonym simply is a word, or more widely, a concept that we hear, but we think instantly of something else. So, for example, if somebody says Washington, that's the name of the nation's capital, but it also has other associations. You hear like, the gridlock in Washington. They're not just talking about a traffic jam in a city, they're talking about legislative dysfunction. So the same thing can be said of Broadway. It's more than a street. It leads us to think of show tunes and the Phantom of the Opera, Wall Street, Main Street. These are examples of metonyms. So Arnheim had an idea of visual metonymy. So he, for example, would show subjects a picture of a triangle. And when you look at the tip of a triangle in a drawing, a lot of times you say sharp. He noticed that subjects were seeing a sharp. Whereas if they saw a curve or a hemisphere, they would say soft. Now, there's nothing in a two-dimensional representation of either of those things that is inherently soft or hard. But the association is powerful. So we are assigning sensory associations to a visual. So similarly, we may look at a color and think of a referent that seems to flow not based on the amplitude of light that we're looking at, but upon the rich realm of our own subjective associations. So we see an aquamarine blue and we think icy. We see purple and we have associations of regality. Green connotes growth. And all of those very trite but unavoidable and persistent associations that form a kind of shorthand in our minds. So we look at a traffic light and suddenly it's not just red, it's a directive. We look at a flashing green light and think of Scott Fitzgerald's most famous book, which was, by the way, recently made into that really, really bad movie by Baz Luhrmann. God, I hated that movie. So green becomes a symbol of that orgastic future that recedes every year before us. It is worth noting, too, the idea that seeing one quality but experiencing a different quality is akin to the experience that neurologists and psychologists call synesthesia, which is people hearing colors or seeing sounds. It supposedly happens a lot in psychedelic trips, I've heard. Interestingly, the British artist Tim Bavington, who works and lives in Las Vegas, uses color to create a kind of simulated synesthesia. He transliterates musical notes, mostly from rock songs, a lot of Ozzy Osbourne, Rolling Stones, Oasis, into airbrushed paint stripes. So he will sort of arbitrarily assign a note in a melody a color, and then it's all set. So this is a melody of a rock song. So all lined up, sort of like a Bridget Riley. And as you can see, the color palette that he favors does in fact have a kind of Haight-Ashbury, Carnaby Street, swinging 60s feel. Now he has also transliterated this conceit into 3 dimensions. This piece right here is a 27 feet high, 86 foot long sculpture that is at the Smith Center in Las Vegas, which is entitled Pipe Dreams. And so in Bavington's hands, music has made the jump into painting and then the jump into 3-dimensional space, all from the idea of turning bars of color, of assigning a different quality, a kind of visual metonymy to color. Now, I want to look at that Ellsworth Kelly again, and there is a ravishment that happens that evokes the separated raw pigment that we see in markets in India or Nepal or elsewhere. And again, the challenge is formidable. Can we as artists, can artists make something more effective, more thrilling than raw pigments lined up in a row? The Scottish academic and author David Batchelor has much to say about the associations with color in a book published in 2000 called Chromophobia. And he uses this book to explicate 2 opposing camps of how intellectual history has viewed color. One that celebrates vivid color, and one that demonizes it. He likens a view of conservative, blanched out colors, or white, to the impeccability or the sterility, depending on what you think of Finnish designer and architect Eero Saarinen's TWA terminal, which is now defunct in New York City. Or, more currently, a Swedish sculptor whom I've written about several times in the past, Eva Hild, who creates these really immaculate ceramic sculptures which evoke coral or other sea life or cow bones that have been bleached out by the sun. Batchelor holds that vibrant color, on the other hand, has stood in for quote, the primitive, the infantile, the vulgar, the pathological, superficial, supplementary, the inessential, or the cosmetic. Color, he summarizes, is dangerous or trivial or both. And as examples of the voluptuary sensualism of color, he calls up the Rolling Stones song, She's a Rainbow, whose lyrics slyly suggest, she's coming in colors, which is referring to a woman's orgasm. Batchelor also talks about Aldous Huxley's observation that color perception is heightened on mescaline. And of course, he brings up the great classic Wizard of Oz, in which plain old Kansas is black and white, but the magical, merry old land of Oz and its capital city, the Emerald City, is in dazzling technicolor. Let me tell you about my own personal Oz. This is a picture that I took at Arroyo Hondo, New Mexico, just north of Taos. Many of you who have lived there or do live there or visited there or made art or bought supplies or taken workshops at Bullseye's Resource Center just off Cerrillos know what it is that New Mexico does with light and what that does with color. One of my biggest quandaries as a writer that I ever had, when I wrote a short story that was sort of based on a month that I spent in Taos, and I wanted to describe the color of the Sangre de Cristos at a certain time of day and in a certain humidity. Now, why I thought that I could describe that, whereas D.H. Lawrence and Willa Cather had tried to do it, who knows? But I was looking at it and thinking, well, it's kind of green, kind of purple, kind of gray, and I wound up simply, putting it somewhere between dark periwinkle and aubergine. Naturally, the legacies of Lawrence and Cather were not compromised by that description, and but the quandaries just illustrated the futility of a writer trying to describe in words what color can do. There is, of course, in northern New Mexico, a purity of color and of experience that is every bit as you would expect from a place that is called La Tierra Encantada, land of enchantment. You think of two modernist artists associated with that state, Georgia O'Keeffe, who said of New Mexico, "I can see farther there," and Agnes Martin, and think about both of their works, and although, of course, they are varied as could be in many respects, what we retain of them in our minds, particularly in association to their time in New Mexico, is this sort of thumbnail sketch of color as something blanched and bleached out, bone dry, bare bones, stripped down, essentialized like an arroyo after the water has evaporated. It is eminently in good taste. It appeals to wasps. It will never be considered vulgar color. Now, contrast that with the approach of an artist that I've been working with recently, Peter Halley. Halley uses day-glow colors. He also uses metallics and pearlescent paints as well as artist pigments. But the use of day-glow is something that he does in order to create not a natural color or not a natural light, but what he calls a technological light. That is the kind of light you would see in a video game or in neon signage or LED. And also, ominously, what kind of light you might see in an irradiated post-nuclear future. Here's a different color scheme using a similar composition. You can't get much farther away from Agnes Martin chromatically, although both of these artists come from a tradition of geometric abstraction and minimalism. Well, this dichotomy plays into David Batchelor's thesis of subdued color evoking the austere and the aristocratic, and vibrant color as garish and gaudy and racy and ripe and plummy and plebeian. There's also plenty of sexism, racism, ageism, and homophobia. in color associations. Of course, only sexy young women, whatever the hell that is supposed to mean, are supposed to wear vibrantly colored clothes and makeup, whereas everybody else is supposed to favor the age-appropriate subdued color, or at least that's the message we have crammed down our throats by the advertising industry. And if you don't toe the line, you're apt to be likened to a lady of the night. We were talking about D.H. Lawrence a second ago, somebody who is never going to be accused of having had proto-feminist views. There's a notorious poem called Fig, in which he contrasts the proper way to eat a fig in society, in stiff, upper-lipped Great Britain, to the vulgar Mediterranean way. And he uses, notably, color associations to misogynist ends. He says, quote, "You're overripe, and you burst forth, giving up your ghost." He's likening color to the menstrual cycle is what he's doing here. "It explodes," he writes, "and you see through the fissure the scarlet, and the fig is finished, the year is over. That is how the fig dies, showing her crimson through the purple slit, like a wound, the exposure of her secret on the open day, like a prostitute." Ooh. Well, men have a little more leeway these days in fashion choices than men do, although if you are a man invited to a black tie event, black tie means black tie. Don't you be wearing any lime green dinner jacket with a red bow tie, or else your masculinity is likely to be impugned. Yeah? Special exceptions granted to David Bowie and CeeLo Green. Color is coded, it is loaded, and we engage it at our own risks. This is an unintentionally blurry picture that I took in the lobby of the Mondrian Hotel in Los Angeles a couple years ago. It was designed by Philippe Starck, and we see this beautiful long marble-topped table, and at the end of it is a bank of LED lights. There's nothing quite like going to a place like this where a large light bank of LEDs is programmed to go through the entirety of the color spectrum at a glacial, tantric pace. There used to be a place called Aura, you may have been to it, across from Powell's on Burnside. You're sitting there and suddenly, you've been in lime green for a long time, and finally you realize, now I'm in forest green. I feel different. And then you hang out some more, and then suddenly you're in the middle of canary red. How did it happen? It happened so slowly. Micron by micron. Whenever I'm in this sort of situation, it always occurs to me that this is more than just a physical change. It feels metaphysical to me. I mean, isn't this how social change often feels? So slowly that you hardly notice, and one day you wake up and the world changes. And a doctor-assisted suicide is legal in Washington and Oregon, and 12 states and the District of Columbia allow marriage between same-sex couples, and an African-American person is the steward of this great nation. How did it happen? The color feels analogous to the continuum of social change, or to the change of our bodies and attitudes as we go along our continuum from point A to point Z. Spend some time immersed in a bank of LED lights like this, and you will know how arbitrary it is to assign values to an infinite continuum. Of course, what happens on the surface of any society, whether or not social change happens slowly or fast or for good or for ill, depends on what is going on beneath the surface. This is a piece called Subsurface. It's by Jessica Laughlin. It is in the show that we're going to see later tonight. A slice of milky white, beneath which lies this wedge of warm butterscotch. We think of Jessica as a poet of the abstracted landscape. I will never forget my first glimpse in 2005 of a series of hers called Open Spaces in a Bullseye show that was called Shifting Views. And the work was based on the Australian landscape as viewed from above, from an airplane. But in this piece, interestingly, it is as if she has delved down into the landscape and burrowed underneath it and allowed us this kind of privileged view of the geology underneath the topography. And by the way, as I talk a little bit about these pieces that are in the show, I want to stress that I'm not knowingly representing the artist's intent. These are just observations of my own. A similar strategy in Abby Spring's Untitled suite of works. How does an underbelly of off-white affect our perception of white? Notice that caramelly, creamy effect. Milk and honey together. We think of Samuel Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan at the end of it, where he says, "Weave a circle round them thrice, and close your eyes in holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise." And in Abby's work we have the milk and the honey, the fearsome and the pure in one aspect. Richard Parrish in the piece Between Walls, Facade, Castleton, and between those gray walls or even grayer windows, more opaque than a fourth window through which light shines in a more gunmetal blue hue. And we wonder, are we just looking at the facade of a given building in Castleton? Or are we looking through the window into the home of our own past, through whose windows we peer and wonder, why is the view so obscured? A piece by Mel Douglas called Midpoint, and sometimes the counterplay between the surface and the interior is not just a matter of hue, but of finish. The subtle brushed metal-like surfaces on the outside belie an interior that is slick and polished and liquidic, and that beckons the light inside even as it glances off the grooves on the outside. It is as if we are looking at the outside of a black hole on that rim. We are looking at the event horizon, and we can only guess what's inside. You know, a black hole is kind of the ultimate vessel, isn't it? And to think that something that is an astrological phenomenon, astronomical phenomenon, to be defined by a color or a lack of color, and that a vessel, this most quotidian of objects, that can be analogous to the cosmic and the macrocosmic. Cassandra Straubing, the counterposition of the quotidian and the profound, I think, is at the heart of this work. We have the sort of plebeian realm of manual labor represented by the work gloves and the wrench, and a garment hanging casually on a coat rack. But, what a garment of kiln-cast glass, caressing in the light and taking it through its folds in a way that is so commonplace, but yet so utterly transformed by this medium. The softness of fabric mimicked, or even perhaps parodied, by the hardness of glass, turned into something surreal. This is like the old Protestant work ethic enshrined and ossified. The idea of something pure being sullied is inherent in this work by Stacy Smith, in which the viewer is invited to take graphite and smear it over the surface of the work. It is graphite, is it not? Yeah. So the viewer is interacting with the piece, adding both the human touch and the human schmutz. To touch is to give ourselves, but it is also to despoil via ourselves. To touch someone is to give a gift in the sense that we say that word in English, that is a present, but it is also perhaps to give a gift, as that word means in German, which is a poison. Sylvia Levinson certainly knows a thing or two about double or triple or quadruple meanings. She is a satirist extraordinaire. She is always reminding us that the distance between beauty and danger is a knife's edge or the length of a gun's trigger. In The Chosen, she shows us using white as the property and the way it interacts with light. The image of a sheep's head on a little girl's body. Now this is either whimsical or deeply, deeply disturbing in ways that conjure up, the Antichrist or the Omen or the Exorcist. It is innocence meets ungeheuer. There's something similarly upsetting about, unsettling about Fawn Sky McDonough's piece Fade. The colors are pure, milky shapes atop a white viewing platform, and yet the shapes themselves seem perverted, biomorphic, visceral, gnarly, like a cochlea turned inside out. We are riveted and repelled at the same time, and above all intrigued by the meeting of the familiar and the unknown. And this, by the way, reminds me very much of drawings by Portland-based artist David Eckerd, who had a 2007 series of work that looked like body parts, but not like any body part you've ever seen in a medical book. And I wrote about it and called it the intersection of desire and deformity. Likewise, Ted Sawyer's piece Welt takes such an elegant monochromatic black palette and uses surface contour to suggest a corruption that appears to be at its very base dermatologic, a welt of some sort of eruption, a wound, a carbuncle, a volcanic protrusion that seems to remind us that the mountain 60 miles to the east of here is not only just a nice place to ski and hike and fish and lodge, but also a slumbering giant that will awaken and turn the verdant hills to soot, as only the amorality of nature can. The association of the color black also in Clifford Rainey's Mourner with corruption, with death, and with the Grim Reaper has been long-standing. And Clifford Rainey's upcoming talk, In the Beginning Was Black, should be fascinating to listen to in this regard. This is a bone-chilling piece, and it encompasses every reason that we hold death in awe and respect. It is inscrutable, it has no face, it has no innards that we can see. It is an empty maw, it is debonairly cloaked, and yet it contains nothing. It is discernible not through any sense of presence, but through a horrific absence. And is it any wonder that thinkers and writers and filmmakers throughout the millennia, and most recently in our own times, have used the color black to evoke evil, Count Dracula, or this guy, whom you may recognize. We spend so much time trying to calm our fears of the dark. Epicurus cautioned us in ways that I still take solace from. In one translation, he wrote, "Where death is, we are not. Where we are, death is not. Therefore, death is of no concern either to the living nor the dead." Elegant turn of phrase, but the Grim Reaper always steps in and says, "The lady doth protesteth too much, methinks." Daphne Kaufmann's Wolves Hunting shows similarly that we fear and respect. She also deploys a monochromatic black palette, using surface as a cue. In this case, these very spiky, sharp prickles of material. If you were colorblind and you looked at it and you didn't know the material, you'd want to walk across it like AstroTurf, but only if you have steel shoes on. It sends a contradictory message that is heightened by its subject matter, the hunting wolf, which, like the reaper, is also a ravenous hunter. If there is anything that remains of us after we have succumbed to that hunter, we may well become mycological phenomenon. And Emily Natchison's crystalline conversion speaks to that. She handles the idea of deliquescence in this piece, the phenomenon of a mushroom blooming and then falling into its own pool of decay. And she does this by treating this most organic, squishy, runny phenomenon in a material that is decidedly and quite plainly hard. She does it by light shining through uncolored glass in a black-walled room. This is one of the most moving installations that I've seen in a year. Tanya Pock's installation, particularly the hanging pieces, uses the sepulcher-like upstairs gallery of Bullseye to brilliant effect, playing that windowless environment with black walls and dramatic lighting for maximum impact. As I was looking at its filigree of clouds over that dining table, that it would be a proper dwelling place for any cherubim or seraphim. And then there is Richard Marquis, trickster, prankster, Cocopelli, coyote, who uses color like the chords in a Looney Tunes serenade that's been orchestrated by Ludwig von Beethoven. I will never forget interviewing him on Whidbey Island and thinking, when I came out of the interview, this is an endearing, world-class artist who is bracingly naive. And then, interestingly enough, as the days went on and I began to replay the things he actually said to me, I realized that he had really done one over on me, and I was the naive. And this was actually a world-class sophisticate who had really pulled some neat trickery. And I think of his use of color in those same terms. A playfulness, this kind of carnival funhouse quality crossed with the fact that we're looking in this piece at a World War I era warboat that was responsible for thousands of deaths. Speaking of funhouse reflections, and you see a kind of distortion in Steve Klein's exploration series that stands at the entrance to the upstairs gallery. And I'm always impressed at how Steve's exuberant chromaticism in this series, or in more chromatically subdued series like the Shelter series, always acts to support the sort of central conceit of the work. whether it be about balance, whether it be about the idea of a wall both as a protector and as an isolator psychologically. In other words, letting color serve the idea rather than vice versa. That idea, of course, of form-following function is endemic in the Bauhaus school, and of the teacher who took Bauhaus ideas and the artist who ran with them like few others have, Klaus Moyer. And yet, for all of his well-considered, extraordinary intelligence in cosmopolitan color and surface effects, I found when I interviewed him in 2008 that he, in some sense, in his head, is just going for broke all the time. He told me that, quote, "I'm so fascinated by the beauty of this material, and I always knew that I could handle it. If I can do just one thing to get one more nuance out of the material, I will do it." And does he ever do it? He is a magician with color, and artists have the capacity to turn color into sorcery or into the stuff of alchemy. I think it's no coincidence that the practitioners of the ancient art of pseudoscience or pseudoscience of alchemy described the between 3 and 14 stages of that process in terms of color, and most particularly black, white, and red as processes that would lead to the philosopher's stone and turn mundane metals into gold. Artists have that power to transmute, and I have no doubt that it is a kind of magic. I am a firm believer that if you as an artist put a specific intent into your use of color, say if you have a memory of a certain blue that was in your grandmother's sofa when you were a kid, or a blue that was the color of your father's eyes, or a blue that you saw on a cruise when the ship went from the Adriatic Sea into the Ionian, that if you, in whatever measure and in whatever method you can for yourself, put that specificity of intention into the piece, it will be manifest in the viewer. I've had the experience of being on the receiving end of that hundreds of times. I don't know how it works, but I know that it's real. It may come across in a way that is oblique or liminal or in the realm of dreams, but it will find home in the viewer if you treat color as a sacrament. So, from myself as a viewer to you as a creator, I would like to share one final observation in the form of this sculpture, which is called From the Heart. It's by a Portland-based sculptor named Martin Eichinger. And you can see it's a man with an arm falling back, other arm touching his heart as if trying to draw something in or bring something out of himself. And Marty conceived this piece as a commentary on gender stereotyping. This is not a pose that, this is kind of a receptive and passive pose that we're not used to seeing men portrayed in sculpture. Women, of course, yeah, we got Danae in the shower of gold, lying back, being showered with gold in the works by Titian and Rembrandt and Klimt and so on. But to see a man back on a wave is a different view of masculinity. When I wrote about the work in 2002, I said that Eichinger had created an image of a man strong enough to swoon. And I tend to see this piece in a way that is more It could be the experience could be being bowled over by romance, by music, by a spiritual experience, or by an artistic or chromatic experience. This is how I feel about color, that it is something that we can surrender to, that it is something that we don't have to be afraid of. We don't have to feel weak if we use it in ways that are unorthodox. My late artist friend Matt Lamb always said that his big realization happened when he determined that color was not going to be able to hurt him, and he was not going to be able to hurt color. And that after he came to that realization, everything changed for him. So let yourself be free to be bowled over, to put the intent into the work, but also to let it flow through you like a shower of gold or a bath of love that you can then put back into the work and send it out into the world as a representation of the finest and noblest capacity that you have as an artist and a human being. Do that, and as always, as a lover of art, I will be grateful and appreciative to see what you come up with. So thank you not only for inviting me here to talk to you today, but also those of you whose work that I have seen and I will see in the future. Thank you for that experience. It is a great joy. Thank you.